So I'll go through a couple quotes to kind of get the general idea. So these are all quotes from Paul of Samosata with some reasonable degree of historical reliability. Two gods would be proclaimed if the Son of God is proclaimed God. Jesus was not before Mary, but received from her the origin of his being. According to the promise, Jesus is a great and elect prophet, becoming both mediator and lawgiver of a better covenant. Christ is a man favored in a singular fashion by divine grace. Christ did wonders according to grace. Part of my point is that he did get elected bishop fairly, so that must have been still within the Overton window of acceptability. But right. I think during his career, and partially because of his career, yes, the Overton window gets shifted to cut him outside of it. Eusebius admits this, that he has a lot of popular support, especially among the common folk. He was seemingly something of a populist.
As we discussed with Origen, Origen seemed to be apart from the day-to-day Christians.
And was kind of condescending and elitist.
Right.
This is what I think is the most ironic thing about Paul of Samosata of all. It's ironic that he's the first one to receive state support and he gets criticized for it, even though that happens to the Trinitarians in about 30 or 40 years. That's ironic. It's ironic that he is deposed by Roman military power at the behest of the Bishop of Rome. That's ironic. The most ironic thing is, so when he is being cross-examined, so what is the Word, what is the Holy Spirit, and how are these things related to God? He says that the Word and the Spirit are homoousios with God. And he is the first Christian in history to use the word homoousios in relation to the Word and the Spirit's connection to God. So if you know your future Christian history, at the Council of Nicaea, the word homoousios will come to be used as the way that God and his Son are the same substance. Homoousios, homo means same in Greek. Ousios means essence or substance or stuff or something like that, right? So when Paul of Samosata is defending his version of the Trinity, more or less, he says that God's Word and God's Spirit are homoousios with him. And what he means is that they are not separate persons. They are part of the same unity, right? They are attributes of God the Father, not separate persons distinct from God the Father. But he uses the word homoousios to describe this. And for a couple decades, the word homoousios becomes forbidden because it was associated with Paul of Samosata. So then at the Council of Nicaea, when the Emperor Constantine says, oh, so the way that you guys are talking about God the Father and the Son, it sounds like you're saying they're homoousios. And this becomes part of the Nicene Creed, even though at the 270 Council that excommunicates Paul of Samosata, he gets excommunicated for using precisely this word to mean almost the exact opposite thing that it will come to mean in the Nicene Creed. So he's the first person to use the most controversial word in the Nicene Creed to describe his own theology, which is just hilarious. The Roman Empire, we mainly associate the Roman Empire sort of falling in the 5th century to barbarians, right? People like Hank coming down from Germany and, sacking Rome and that sort of thing. But the empire almost fell apart in the 3rd century. There were there was like a huge succession of emperors where every year or two there would be a new emperor, and basically it would be some general from the army who would extort the population to be made emperor, and then he would get a pile of money, and then he would appoint some generals, and then the generals would be like, well, why don't I just do the same thing that he did? I'll kill him, and then I'll extort the population for money, and then I'll get to be emperor. But you do that, and then the next person behind you is ready to do the same thing to you. And there was also plagues, and there was also incursions from the barbarians in the north and incursions from the Persians in the east. So the empire was at its weakest state that it had ever been since it had been founded in the mid 3rd century. And so, like, here's a little bit of a relevant timeline. In 260 AD, basically the same year that Paul Samosata gets appointed Bishop of Antioch, the Emperor Valerian is captured by Persian troops. He is the first ever Roman emperor to be captured and kidnapped by a foreign enemy. First time in history that happens, and that doesn't go well for him. I'll say that. And during this time, Rome is starting to lose control of its eastern properties, including Syria. It's unclear exactly when they lose control of Syria, but that's probably because it was just sort of a messy, hazy, chaotic situation where no one was quite sure who was in charge. In 260 AD, after Valerian's killed, he's succeeded by a guy named Gallienus. And then Gallienus is emperor for about 8 years, but then he gets assassinated as part of a conspiracy. He's succeeded by a guy named Claudius, who dies of a plague in 270 AD. After a couple years of fighting, a guy named Aurelian takes over, and he's emperor for a while, and he retakes Syria in 272 AD. So there is this 12-year period from the defeat of the Emperor Valerian by the Persians to the reconquering of Syria by Aurelian in 272 AD. And this is exactly the period where Paul of Samosata is Bishop of Antioch, which is in the province of Syria. The Antioch is currently in what we would call southeastern Turkey, but back then it was, considered part of Syria. So the reason why this is important to Paul's story is there is this chaotic situation where the Roman Empire seems to be in decline, and Syria is kind of up for grabs. So now we need to talk about who I think is one of the most interesting people in history. And there is this lady named Queen Zenobia. So in 260 AD, around the same time that that Rome has possibly lost control of Syria, her husband becomes king of Palmyra. So Palmyra is a city kind of in the desert in eastern Syria. It's sort of along a prominent trade route between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And it's sort of kind of like halfway in between. And so when Rome loses control of the city, her husband appoints himself as king because, there was political anarchy otherwise. And in 267 AD, her husband dies. And kind of after letting her son rule for a while, she eventually takes sole control of the monarchy as queen herself. And she's one of the only female absolute monarchs in this period of history. There weren't a lot of female emperors or female queens who were top dog in their kingdom at this period of time. And she's one of the few examples. So starting in about 267 AD, she takes full control of the kingdom of Palmyra. And she is actually quite successful at conquering a lot of land. Her kingdom reaches its maximum extent, right, from Turkey to Egypt to Saudi Arabia. And then in 272 AD, this Roman Emperor Aurelian retakes a lot of her territory. She's put on trial, she's publicly humiliated, but then she's brought to Rome as part of Aurelian's triumph. And then she's kind of allowed to live as part of the Roman aristocracy until she dies a couple years later. But for 5-10 years, this kingdom is a serious superpower in the vacuum of power left between the weakened Roman Empire and the weakened Persian Empire. So this is the context in which Paul of Samosata is the bishop of Antioch. So remember, like I said earlier, he has this identity that kind of links him to Syria and kind of a low class, possibly more Syrian identity as opposed to a Greco-Roman identity. And so what's interesting is so he's appointed bishop in 260 AD. In 264 AD, a synod is gathered because basically Paul is teaching biblical Unitarianism, and this is rubbing some people wrong. And so there's a synod convened in Antioch with some of the bishops of the surrounding area and presbyters and other important churchmen from the surrounding area. And it's unclear if he was actually condemned at this synod, or if he received a slap on the wrist, or if they were unable to come to some sort of consensus about him being heretical or not. But in any case, he stays in power, but clearly the synod was gathered because enough people were worried that he was teaching heretical things to consider it worthwhile to call a synod. But nothing seems to come of this synod politically. In 270 AD, so Queen Zenobia has taken over Antioch, and in 270 AD, Paul of Samosata starts being patronized by the Queen Zenobia. So this is, I should say, it is the first time in Christian history that we know of where a bishop is receiving state support from an empire. So Queen Zenobia, she's trying to scrap together her new Middle Eastern kingdom. And one thing that she does is that she finds religious minorities that had previously been persecuted by either the Romans or the Persians, and she gives them freedom of religion and maybe even some state funding. And this is probably a political move to try and win up popular support for her empire by finding the people who were unhappy with their previous empires and making them happy in her own empire. And this includes giving state financial support to the Christian church, or at least the Church of Antioch. And this is, like I said, as far as we know, the first time in history where the church has received state support. Up until now, it's been persecuted either in the Roman Empire or even where it's expanded beyond the Roman Empire, it's at least not a state-supported religion. So this is interesting. And this kind of ruffles the feathers of the bishops that are still in the Roman Empire, right? So you can imagine that when Paul of Samosata decides that he's going to accept the patronage of the Queen Zenobia, that this looks like, if you're the Bishop of Rome, or if you're in France or North Africa or some part that's still part of the Christian Empire, you might be worried that this is going to make the Christians look like political enemies of Rome, even more than they already have that reputation, if they are helping to shore up the popular support of this queen who's gobbling up former Roman territory in the eastern part of the empire. And so this, you could imagine, is probably seen as a political threat to the reputation of the Christians who are still loyal to the Roman Empire. Anyway, I've been talking. So when this aristocratic Greco-Roman synod comes to Antioch to try and depose him, he's like, what are you going to do? Good luck. The people are on my side. Queen Zenobia is on my side. So what if you had been in about 270, and then in about 272, the Emperor Aurelian reconquers Syria and, takes Queen Zenobia captive and sends her to Rome, right? And so in an episode that I think is just absolutely fascinating, the Bishop of Rome asks Aurelian to use his military to depose Paul of Samosata. So this is the first time in history that a bishop has asked the Roman military to do something for them, and the Roman military does it. So they go to Antioch, and so what's interesting is in 272, Paul of Samosata is removed from his post, and he is replaced by his predecessor's son. So Paul had become bishop in 260. The person who died in 260 that Paul replaced, his son then replaces him. And you might say, how do bishops have sons? I thought bishops were celibate. Well, they weren't always back then.
No.
It was admired for bishops to be celibate, but they could also have families and children at that point in time.
So it's clear that Paul really ticked off a lot of the bishops.
Yes.
To get a bishop to say, go to the Roman emperor and say, hey, can you do me a solid?
Yeah.
And get rid of this guy. And what's more amazing is that the Roman emperor actually got in the middle of an ecclesiastical disagreement.
Yeah. And you could imagine his motivation for doing so would be, it was part of reconquering the territory. Okay, I'm getting rid of Queen Zenobia and I'm bringing Syria back under my control. Okay, the Syrian church is kind of rebelling against me. I'm going to put someone that the Roman bishop likes put it in charge, and that will sort of be a way of bringing the Christian population back under my control. So you could imagine that being his motivation for why.
And that then created a 40-year peace between the Roman Empire and the church.
I don't think it was quite that long, because the persecution of Diocletian, which is one of the most severe persecutions that the church ever endures, is in like the 290s and early 300s, and that's only 25-30 years later. So
okay,
yeah. But we'll get to the Diocletian persecution later, because that creates the Donatist controversy and a whole bunch of other this. It is pretty amazing that this empire that has persecuted the church on and off for over 200 years at this point, and this church that more or less fears the empire, would then suddenly get along well enough for the church to ask the emperor to use his military force to depose a recalcitrant bishop is a pretty amazing, it's the first event of its kind in Christian history.